Around 1973, in Harlan County, Kentucky, the late afternoon light slanted through the window as a pot of syrup boiled on the stove. At the time, a pound of white sugar cost about 18 cents. Less than a pound of sugar, along with corn syrup and baking soda, was enough to begin a batch of candy that could be shared around the room. The cook watched the bubbles, tested the syrup in cold water, and waited for exactly the right moment to lift the pot from the heat. Children stood behind the table, listening to the rustle of wax paper and watching the buttered tin trays. That skill lived in the eyes, the fingertips, the experience passed down through many seasons. The cards in the box tell of candy that puffed up like foam, candy that shattered like glass, 5 colored packets beside the cash register, crowded candy-pulling gatherings, and chocolate candies filled with liquid cherry centers. The final card carries the scent of dry leaves and the care of family. Pull up a chair. 25 mountain candies begin with candy number 25. If these sounds remind you of your grandmother's kitchen, subscribe to the channel so that each week another card can be opened again. Hot sugar, cast iron skillets, and the sound of candy breaking. Before young children rolled candy on waxed paper, the cook had to stand close to the stove. Sugar steam fogged the window panes, while the sound of boiling syrup warned that a single moment of hesitation could change the entire batch of candy. Item number 25, honeycomb. Candy. As soon as the baking soda touched the hot syrup, the whole pot of sugar rose, hissed softly, and swelled into a layer of golden foam. In 1973, in Harlan County, Kentucky, 1 pound of white sugar cost about 18 cents. With corn syrup and a little baking soda added, the cook could fill a tin tray for the church bake sale. She poured the sugar, syrup, and a little water into a heavy pot, watching as the mixture became clear, boiled vigorously, and then turned a deep golden color. She lifted the pot from the stove, sprinkled in the baking soda, stirred quickly, and poured it onto a buttered tray. The foam held its own shape and hardened into countless tiny air pockets. The children stood behind the table, listening to the cooling candy crackle and smelling the faintly burned sugar. She judged the temperature with her eyes and experience. She watched the color of the sugar. Eat number 24. Glass candy cooked in a casting skillet. Christmas lights shone through the thin pieces of amber candy, making them look like stained glass from an old window. In 1971, in Wise County, Virginia, 1 pound of white sugar cost nearly 15 cents. In a miner's family home, a cast-iron skillet used to fry chicken and bake cornbread, sometimes held a batch of hard candy for the holiday season. The cook mixed the sugar with just enough water, then set the skillet over medium heat. Once the sugar had completely dissolved, the wooden spoon was set aside. The syrup continued to boil, gradually changing from clear to golden and then amber. She tilted the skillet and poured the gleaming stream of sugar onto a buttered plate. As it cooled, a crack ran across the surface, followed by a soft, sharp snapping sound. The clear pieces of candy lay near the window, catching the winter light. No one looked away. Number 20. Butterscotch drops. The smell of melted butter and brown sugar drifted out of the kitchen before the first piece of candy touched the tray. 1971, in Johnson City, Tennessee, 1 pound of brown sugar cost about 29 cents. With butter, corn syrup, and a few drops of vinegar, a family could fill a glass jar with amber-colored candies. She melted the butter in a heavy pot, added the brown sugar and syrup, stirred until they blended, and then let the mixture continue to boil. As the candy darkened, she quickly scooped up small spoonfuls and dropped them onto a buttered tray. Each drop rounded out within a few seconds beneath the yellow light. Once cooled, candies were placed in a jar or tin and eaten a few at a time throughout the week. The hard candies dissolved slowly, carrying their sweet buttery flavor all the way home. One piece lasted a very long time. The first 3 candies belonged to high heat, watchful eyes, and hands that knew when to stop. The next cards carry the story toward powdered sugar, waxed paper, and small handprints on the tabletop. Sweet treats that net no oven. After the sound boiled syrup and the freshly cooled pieces of hard candy, the kitchen shifted into a gentler rhythm. The flame was turned down, the heavy pot was set aside, and powdered sugar, wax paper, and small hands waiting to be given a task appeared on the table. Some candies began at that very moment. The children pulled their chairs closer and learned how to turn a few pantry ingredients into a sweet treat marked by their own hands. Item number 20. Whoa, peanut butter balls. A sheet of wax paper lay beside the window, covered with candy balls of different, uneven, rounded shapes. The larger ones held thumbprints. The smaller ones still bore the mark of a fingernail, and the child who had made them was still standing beside the table, covered in powdered sugar all the way to the wrists. Around 1975, in Pike County, Kentucky, a 12-ounce jar of peanut butter cost about 79 cents. Grandmother spooned the peanut butter into a deep bowl, added the powdered sugar 1 spoonful at a time, and then added a few drops of vanilla. The spoon tapped lightly against the side of the bowl with a steady knocking sound, while the scent of roasted peanuts blended with the fragrant sweetness and drifted through the room. Once the candy mixture became less sticky, the children pinched off small portions, rolled them between their palms, and placed them on the wax paper. Some were coated in cocoa, some were rolled in cookie crumbs, and the rest were left in their natural light brown color. This was often a child's first lesson in candy making, a place where a child could slowly reshape a piece of candy without ruining the entire batch. Even children knew how to make them. Item number 21. Peanut butter rolled potato candy. A cooled boiled potato remained on the plate after dinner. A little while later, that potato became a white candy roll, the soft peanut butter swirl appearing in the center of every slice. In 1972, in McDowell County, West Virginia, a 5-pound bag of potatoes cost nearly 49 cents. Grandmother mashed 1 small potato until completely smooth, then added powdered sugar until the mixture formed a soft, pliable dough. The dough was placed between 2 sheets of wax paper, rolled into a rectangle, and spread with a thin layer of richly scented peanut butter. She rolled it tightly from the edge of the paper, wrapped it securely, and placed it somewhere cold. When the knife passed through it, each round revealed even rings of white and brown, like tiny circles of wood grain. In a kitchen where every bit of food was valued, a leftover potato could always take on a new role. The potato had another life. Time number 20. Coconut balls. The white coconut balls sat in rows on a tray, looking like tiny snowballs that had never seen winter. Powdered sugar clung to fingertips, while the scent of sweetened condensed milk and vanilla made the kitchen feel warmer. Around 1978, in Beckley, Raleigh County, West Virginia, a 14-ounce can of sweetened condensed milk cost about 59 cents. The adults mixed shredded coconut with sweetened condensed milk and vanilla, then divided the mixture into small portions. The children rolled the candy into balls, coated them in powdered sugar, and arranged them on wax paper. Batches made for the holidays sometimes hid a preserved cherry in the center, or were dipped halfway into chocolate. The work was divided evenly around the table. 1 person mixed, 1 portioned out the candy, 1 child rolled it, and another carefully arranged it on the tray. By the time the fundraising bake sale began, every piece of candy carried the touch of the entire family. Their handprints remained on the paper. Those sweets belonged to the kitchen table and the sound of laughter inside the house. Beyond the screen door, the wooden floor of the country store was waiting, along with packets of candy that children could choose for themselves with coins held tightly in their pockets. Small coins at the country store. The screen door sprang open with a soft sound. The wooden floor sagged beneath children's footsteps, while the ceiling fan turned slowly above the sacks of flour leaning against the wall. Behind the glass counter were coffee cans, candy jars, and a cash register that rang ding. In a shirt pocket, 1 nickel was enough to change the entire afternoon. Number 19. Perry Jane peanut butter and molasses candy. One small piece of candy could take nearly 5 minutes to chew. For a child with little spending money, that length of time was worth more than the size of the treat. Around 1972, at stores serving coal camps in Mingo County, West Virginia, one Mary Jane candy cost about 2 cents. A child placed a coin on the counter, listened to the sound of metal touching wood, and received a piece of candy wrapped in wax paper. The wrapper was peeled away slowly, releasing the scent of molasses and peanut butter before the sweetness touched the tongue. The candy was held in the mouth and allowed to soften gradually. When the outer layer began to grow pliable, the back teeth separated it into small pieces. One piece was enough for a long ride, a church service, or an afternoon spent sitting on the porch. The pleasure came slowly. Number 18. Five-flavor Chuckles Jelly Candy. 5 pieces of candy lay in a straight row inside the package, red, yellow, green, orange, and black. Each color presented a choice, and deciding which piece to eat first sometimes took longer than buying the candy itself. In 1975, in Logan County, West Virginia, a package of Chuckles cost about 10 cents and was often placed beside the cash register. Children peeled back the slightly waxy wrapper, leaving their fingertips white with powdered sugar. One piece was pulled from the package, and the thick jelly trembled slightly before springing back beneath the teeth. Some children chose their favorite flavor first. Others saved the best color for last. This candy could withstand a bumpy truck ride and changing seasonal weather, making it well-suited to a place where merchandise arrived one shipment at a time. 5 pieces were enough for an afternoon. Item number 17. Candy Cigarettes. The lid of the small box flipped open, revealing white sugar sticks with red tips that looked like glowing embers. Around 1970, in Hazard, Perry County, Kentucky, a box like that cost about 5 cents. Children tapped the box against their palms, pulled out one stick, and held it between 2 fingers. Some varieties were coated with a thin layer of powder that created a small cloud of white dust when blown into the cold air. At the time, this was often seen as a game of imitating adults. Today, attitudes have changed, so the candy should be remembered as an object of its era and as part of the moment when children first chose a treat with their own money. 5 cents once meant freedom. The one-room store. The ceiling fan continued to turn, the wooden floor continued to creak. The shopkeeper knew every child's parents, while the children knew by heart which treats they could afford with the money in their hands. Factory-made candy arrived by truck, while homemade candy came from the kitchen behind the house. The 2 paths met on the glass counter and then traveled together into memory. Store-bought candy belonged to coins and afternoons. Next cards take the story back into the kitchen, where a batch of candy required many hands to pull, fold, and keep the same rhythm together. Candy-pulling gatherings that kept the whole room in rhyme. Leaving the glass counter of the country store behind, the story returns to a more crowded kitchen. A batch of pulled candy required hot sugar, buttered hands, arms strong enough for the work, and an evening when no one wanted to get up and leave too early. Once the mass of candy was placed on the table, the cook's work became something shared by everyone in the room. Eaten number 16. Brown cigar pulled candy. The smell of molasses rose from the glossy mass of brown sugar, blending with the warm scent of butter and the faint sharpness of vinegar. When it was first poured onto the buttered tabletop, the candy was still as dark as chestnut wood. Only a few minutes later, that color began to grow lighter with every pull. Around 1970, in Claiborne County, Tennessee, a 1-pound box of brown sugar cost about 25 cents. After Saturday dinner, when the dishes had been turned upside down to dry and the smell of food had faded from the kitchen, the cook heated brown sugar with butter, vinegar, and a little water. She tested its pliability, tilted the pot, and poured the mixture onto the prepared surface. Everyone rubbed butter into their palms. The candy was just cool enough to handle. Two people lifted it, stretched it out, folded it in half, and pulled it again. The sound of hands meeting the soft sugar mass formed a steady rhythm, mixed with the scraping of chairs and unfinished conversations. Each fold worked more air into the candy, gradually changing its brown color into a soft shade of gold. Finally, the candy was twisted into ropes, cut into small pieces, and placed on waxed paper. The candy grew lighter in their hands. Number 15. Sunday afternoon pulled sugar candy. After Sunday dinner, the sound of dishes faded, but the house was not yet quiet. From the long table came laughter, the sound of candy being stretched, and the rustle of wrapping paper beneath people's fingers. Around 1970, in Lee County, Virginia, 1 pound of white sugar cost nearly 14 cents. A large batch, made from sugar, water, vinegar, and butter, could be shared among several families after the church service. The cook poured the hot candy onto buttered plates, waited until steam stopped rising from the surface, and then divided it into several portions. Each person held a small mass, pulled it into a long rope, folded it over, and continued pulling until the clear sugar turned opaque white. As they worked, the adults asked one another about the crops and their jobs. Young children ran through the rooms, occasionally stopping to watch the long strands of candy gleaming beneath the light. Young couples might stand facing each other, each holding one end of the candy, and burst into laughter when the mass of sugar suddenly sagged. When the strands had become light enough, they were twisted, cut, and wrapped into individual portions. The candy itself melted fairly quickly, but the evening was often remembered much longer. The whole room moved to the same rhythm. Item number 14. Sorghum molasses, pulled candy. Dark sorghum molasses flowed from the mouth of the jug, thick and slow, carrying the smell of dry grass, warm earth, and the lingering smoke from the syrup-making season. That fragrance made the kitchen seem to hold on to a corner of a late autumn field. Around 1970, in Hancock County, Tennessee, a jug containing nearly 1 liter of sorghum molasses cost about $1.25. For families who grew their own sorghum, the value of the jug also reflected months of labor. The crop had to be planted, tended, cut, pressed for its juice, and cooked for many hours before the final thick syrup appeared. The cook poured the molasses into a pot, added butter and a little vinegar, and heated it until the mixture reached the right pliability. The mass of molasses was poured onto a buttered tabletop, releasing a rich, sweet scent touched with smoke. When the heat had eased, everyone began to pull, fold, and twist it. The dark brown color gradually brightened into a copper shade, while the surface became smoother with every movement of their arms. Each piece of candy held the field, the press, the syrup kettle, the evening when many people stayed together. Autumn rested inside the candy. Candy pulling evenings ended with waxed paper, evenly divided portions, and hands that still smelled of butter. Next, candies would travel beyond the kitchen, resting in tin boxes, crossing fences, and being carried to a neighbor's house as a quiet way of asking how they were doing. Tin boxes carried to the neighbors. After the lively candy-pulling gatherings, the sweetness began to leave the kitchen in a quieter way. An old tin box might pass through 3 homes in the same week, carrying with it the scent of butter, the rustle of wax paper, and the time given by the person who had patiently stood beside the pot. Some boxes were sent to visit a neighbor who was ill. Others were placed on a church table. When a box returned, it sometimes held a different treat because the box itself also took part in the community's cycle of giving and receiving. Item number 13. Hard butter candy in a tin pan. The pan trembled slightly when the knife handle came down against the sheet of candy. A sharp crack rang out, drawing the children in from the next room before the adults could place the first pieces into the box. Around 1973, in Bell County, Kentucky, 1 pound of butter cost nearly $1.03. Because butter held considerable value in a family kitchen, a batch of candy was usually reserved for company, the holiday season, or a visit to the house next door. Grandmother placed nearly equal amounts of butter and sugar into the pot, stirred as they began to melt, and slowly watched the pale golden color deepen into honey brown and finally into a rich amber. As soon as the scent of toasted butter began to rise, she tilted the pot and quickly poured the candy into a pan that had already been coated with a thin layer of butter. Some batches were sprinkled with pecans, some were covered with chocolate, while many were left with their surfaces plain and glossy. The sheet of candy cooled as the metal made faint contracting sounds, and then it was broken into pieces of different sizes. They were arranged in a paper-lined tin box and carried to a gathering at the church. No two pieces were alike. Number 12. Peanut brittle. The sound of the candy cracking announced that the gift was ready before the scent of roasted peanuts had finished spreading through the room. Within the clear amber sugar, each peanut appeared like a small fragment preserved in the last sunlight of the day. In 1974, in Knox County, Tennessee, 1 pound of peanuts cost nearly 59 cents. Sugar, corn syrup, water, and a little salt were cooked to the hard crack stage. Grandmother poured in the peanuts, added butter, and stirred so quickly that the wooden spoon made a rapid scraping sound around the sides of the pot. As soon as the pot was removed from the stove, baking soda was sprinkled in. The sugar mixture immediately rose, becoming lighter and more porous. She poured the mixture onto a buttered pan and spread it thin with a spoon before the surface had time to set. In every family, the method differed slightly. Some preferred roasted peanuts for their richer aroma, but others used raw peanuts so they would cook directly in the sugar. Some households used butter, while others used margarine. Those details rarely appeared in full on the recipe card because the most important part was often held in the maker's memory. The sound announced the sweetness. Eating number 11, pantry caramel. The wooden spoon traveled around the bottom of the pot, slowly and steadily. Steam from the cream covered the cook's face, while the scent of brown sugar deepened with every passing minute. The hand had to maintain the same rhythm because pausing for too long even once was enough to turn the gentle flavor of milk into a scorched taste. Around 1976, in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a pound of butter cost nearly $1.20. For families that kept dairy cows, a season of plentiful cream sometimes allowed them to set aside some butter and cream for holiday caramels. Grandmother placed cream, brown sugar, butter, and corn syrup into a heavy pot, cooked them over low heat, and stirred until the mixture thickened, became glossy, and fell from the spoon in heavy ribbons. The caramel was poured into a buttered pan and left to cool until the surface was just firm enough. Grandmother used a buttered knife to cut it into individual squares while the candy was still warm. Each piece was wrapped separately in wax paper, with both ends twisted like a small gift. Caramels belonged to seasons when milk was plentiful, days when guests came to visit, and occasions when people wanted to share the finest part of their home. Each piece was shared slowly. Cigar marks in the receipt box. The lid of the recipe box was opened for the second time. The scent of old paper came first, followed by a dried vanilla stain and card corners made glossy by butter. A patch of brown syrup caused 2 sheets of paper to stick tightly together. The Christmas candy recipe lay beside the pickle card. The caramel recipe was stored behind a grocery list for Easter week. A scrap of paper with a telephone number written on it was still tucked beside the peanut brittle card. Those pieces of paper preserved the rhythm of life around the kitchen, from holidays and visits to neighbors to telephone calls, once written down in haste beside the table. The box had never held only food. Beneath the butter-stained cards were the scents of maple wood and nutshells, along with a current of late winter air. The next treats carry the harvest season with them, as though the forest and the kitchen had written a recipe together. When late winter and autumn met in candy beneath the cards that still carried the scent of butter. Another group of recipes slowly unfolded. They brought with them late winter tree sap, autumn forest nuts, and egg whites reserved for the Christmas candy plate. Here, sweetness followed the rhythm of the seasons. Item number 10. Soft mapley candy roll steam from the maple syrup fogged the window pane. The scents of damp wood, stove smoke, and deep sweetness blended in the cold room. Around 1971 in Randolph County, West Virginia, 1 pint of pure maple syrup cost nearly $1.89. For families who tapped their own trees, the syrup reserved for candy came only after many days of hanging buckets, tending fires, and boiling down the sap. She cooked the syrup to the softball stage, removed the pot from the heat, and let it cool. As the spoon moved through it, the clear amber color gradually turned opaque, thick, and smooth like cream. Mixture was placed on waxed paper, rolled into a log, chilled, and then cut into slices. Each slice held the smoky scent of a season of work that had nearly come to an end. Late winter tasted like this. Item number 9. Peanut candy. The sound of a small hammer striking black walnut shells rang steadily across the tabletop. Each time a shell cracked, nut meat fell into the bowl, along with a little brown dust and the faint scent of rich oil. In 1974, in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, 1 pint of maple syrup cost about $2.49. Walnuts had been gathered in the autumn, dried, and saved for candy-making season. The syrup was cooked to the softball stage, cooled, and then beaten until it became lighter in color. While the maple cream was still pliable, she mixed in the chopped nuts, pressed the mixture into a buttered pan, and waited for the surface to set. Young children sat nearby, picking out the remaining pieces of shell and learning patience before they were allowed to taste the reward. 2 seasons in 1 piece. Number 8. Divinity white candy. The outside broke lightly beneath the teeth, while the inside melted so quickly that it almost disappeared. On the holiday plate, the ivory-colored pieces looked as light as snow foam. Around 1973, in Charleston, West Virginia, a dozen eggs cost nearly 78 cents. 2 egg whites were beaten until they held stiff peaks. In another pot, brown sugar, white sugar, corn syrup, and water boiled into a thick stream. She poured the hot syrup into the egg whites in a very thin stream, continuing to beat steadily until the mixture thickened and held its shape. Vanilla and a pinch of salt were added last. Spoonfuls of candy were dropped onto waxed paper, sometimes with half a pecan placed on top. Once cooled, the candy was both crisp and soft, as delicate as something reserved for a special occasion. It was lighter than it looked. The previous 3 candies preserved the rhythm of forest trees and the changing seasons. The next cards carry the story toward rosewater, rice paper, almonds, and chocolate, opening the door of the mountain kitchen to the wider world. Candies that traveled from industrial cities to holiday tables. After the scent of maple wood, walnut shells, and the ivory-white plates of Christmas candy, next cards carry the kitchen beyond the familiar mountain slopes. Some recipes came from Pittsburgh. Some treats arrived in gift boxes from Cincinnati, and some ingredients were found in shops where the aroma of roasted coffee mingled with the fragrance of roses. They remind us that the recipe box once opened its doors to flavors from the outside world as well. To number 7. Turkish Delight. The scent of roses spread through the kitchen before the first piece of candy was cut. Some found the fragrance elegant, while others smiled, and said it smelled like the perfumed soap kept in a dresser drawer. Around 1979, in Pittsburgh's Strip District in Pennsylvania, a 4-ounce bottle of rose water cost nearly $1.29. Among the immigrant market stalls, working families could encounter Middle Eastern spices, nuts, and sweets that had once seemed very unfamiliar in a mountain kitchen. The cook heated sugar, water, and lemon juice in a deep pot. In a bowl beside it, she mixed cornstarch with cold water until the mixture was smooth. The starch mixture was poured slowly into the syrup while the spoon continued stirring through the gel as it gradually became translucent. Once the mixture had thickened, a few drops of rosewater or citrus flavoring were added. The candy was poured into a pan, left undisturbed overnight, and then cut into soft squares. Powdered sugar coated every side to keep the pieces from sticking together. The candy was like a small doorway opening from the family kitchen table into a wider world. A fragrance from far away. Eat number 6. Soft white nut nougat. 2 pots of syrup, boiled at 2 different temperatures. The person held the whisk, while the other leaned close to the thermometer. Heat covered their faces, as the sound of the spoons striking the side of the pot grew more urgent with every passing minute. In 1979, Pittsburgh, 8 ounces of almonds cost nearly $1.39. Because the ingredients were expensive and the process involved many steps, soft white nut nougat was usually reserved for Christmas. The cook had enough time and another pair of hands standing nearby. The egg whites were beaten separately until fluffy. The 2 portions of syrup were poured one after the other into the bowl in thin streams, while the arm had to maintain a steady rhythm without stopping. Butter, vanilla, roasted nuts, and candied fruit were folded in last. The warm scent of almonds blended with the vanilla, while the white candy mixture quickly grew heavier beneath the spoon. There was very little time to shape it. The cook had to press the candy into a pan lined with rice paper before it lost its softness. Once cooled, the candy was cut into small slices and often placed on a plate reserved for guests. This batch required 2 sets of hands. Item number 5. Chocolate-covered cherries with liquid centers. The chocolate shell broke beneath the teeth with a very soft crack. Immediately afterward, the cherry syrup flowed out, carrying the rich sweetness of the fruit and the whole soft cherry still resting in the center. Around 1978, in Cincinnati, Ohio, an 8-ounce jar of preserved cherries cost nearly 89 cents. These candies often appeared in foil-lined gift boxes, on tables set for guests, or in small paper cups arranged neatly at the end of the year. The cook formed the fondant into a firm mass, rolled it thin, and wrapped it completely around each cherry. The round candies were left overnight so that the moisture from the fruit could gradually seep out and turn the inner layer of sugar into syrup. Each piece was then dipped into tempered chocolate, lifted very slowly to allow the excess coating to drip away, and placed on wax paper. Each piece required several days of waiting from the moment the center was wrapped until the chocolate coating had completely set. Yet, when the candies were served, each one often disappeared in a single bite. Many days, a few seconds. 20 candies have passed through hot flames, wax paper, country stores, candy pulling gatherings, tin boxes, maple forests, and recipes that traveled home along city roads. 4 cards now remain in the recipe box. 1 is dusted with cocoa, 1 carries the scent of brown sugar, 1 records the method for pulling cream candy, and the final card holds a pressed, dried herb leaf. Final 4, recipe cards, and what the mountain. Communities held on to 21 candies had passed through pots of hot sugar, glass store counters, crowded candy pulling evenings, old tin boxes, and forest nuts gathered in autumn. At the bottom of the recipe box, 4 cards now remained. 1 was dusted with cocoa, 1 carried the scent of brown sugar, 1 contained brief notes on how to pull cream candy, and the last held the imprint of a dried leaf pressed between 2 layers of paper. Those 4 recipes made clear what the mountain kitchen had once understood. Sweetness could come from sugar, but the meaning of candy also came from time spent waiting, the memory held in the hands, and the way one person quietly cared for another. Number 4. Bourbon balls. After the young children had gone to bed, the sound of footsteps on the stairs had faded, and only the adults remained in the living room. A different plate was brought out. On it were dark brown candies, coated with a thin layer of powdered sugar, giving off the gentle aroma of cocoa, pecans, and bourbon. Around 1976, in Frankfort, Kentucky, a 750-milliliter bottle of bourbon cost nearly $4.49. The amount of liquor used in one batch of candy was fairly small, but its notes of wood, vanilla, and warmth soaked into every crumb. The cook crushed vanilla wafers into a fine powder, the wooden rolling pin sounding steadily against the tabletop in the now quiet kitchen. She added powdered sugar, cocoa, chopped pecans, and corn syrup, then poured in the bourbon a little at a time. The mixture was blended until it came together into a soft, dark mass with a deep aroma. She pinched off individual portions, rolled them into balls, and coated them in powdered sugar or chopped nuts. The candies were arranged in a tin and stored for at least one day. Overnight, the sharpness of the liquor softened, the cocoa became richer, and the flavors blended together. This candy belonged to late-night conversations. The cups of coffee had gone cold, and the adults still did not want the gathering to end. This plate was brought out late. Item number 3. Brown sugar fudge. The pot of brown sugar was lifted from the stove and set on a thick trivet. The bubbling gradually subsided, leaving behind a silence the cook had to respect. The wooden spoon lay beside it, waiting for the precise moment when it could touch the mixture. In 1977, in Wheeling, West Virginia, 1 pound of brown sugar cost nearly 49 cents. At church fundraising bake sales, the trays of fudge were often placed near the front, each square topped with half a walnut as a sign that the person who made it had put considerable effort into the work. She cooked the brown sugar, milk, butter, and a little salt to the softball stage. Once the pot was set down, the mixture had to cool undisturbed. Stirring too early could cause the sugar to crystallize into coarse grains, while waiting too long would allow the candy to harden before it could be poured into the pan. At the right moment, she picked up the wooden spoon and began to beat the mixture. The sound of the spoon scraping around the sides of the pot grew heavier, and the glossy surface slowly turned dull. When the spoon left a clear trail through the mixture, she poured the candy into a buttered pan, scored it into squares, and placed half a walnut on each portion. The skill lay in the moment when waiting turned into action. The card could record the temperature, but only the hand could recognize the weight of the spoon. The spoon knew when to stop. Kentucky pulled cream candy. The candy began as a creamy yellow mass. Each time it was stretched and folded back over itself, it grew a little brighter until the surface turned white and a satin sheen ran along every fold. Around 1977, in Montgomery County, Kentucky, 1 pint of heavy cream cost nearly 89 cents. The cold days were from breast for making the stone surface and winter air helped the mixture cool quickly while extending the period during which it remained pliable enough to pull. The cook heated the cream, sugar, and a pinch of salt to the required stage. She poured the mixture onto a buttered stone surface, where the heat rose in a thin layer of steam. When the edges of the candy began to firm, the two people slipped their hands underneath, lifted the mass of sugar, and stretched it out. The candy was folded, turned in a different direction, and pulled again. Their arms gradually grew tired, but the surface became smoother. The pale yellow color turned white, while the candy, heavy at first, gradually grew lighter in their hands. Finally, it was twisted into ropes, cut into small pieces, and left to rest overnight. The card recorded the ingredients and temperature, but the feeling of the candy being just cool enough to hold and just warm enough to pull belonged to memory. It was learned by standing beside those who came before, watching how they touched, lifted, and folded the candy. The hands made the candy grow brighter. Item number 1. White Horehound Herbal Candy. The final card carried a scent entirely different from the recipes before it. The slightly bitter smell of dried leaves clung to the paper, as though the bag of herbs, once placed beside it, were still lying somewhere in the cupboard. The finished candy was amber-colored, dissolved slowly, and allowed the sweetness to appear only after the first layer of herbal flavor. Around 1970, in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, 1 pound of white sugar cost nearly 14 cents. Its white horehound leaves were often gathered along fence lines or at the edges of gardens, then dried and stored in paper bags for the cold season. The cook washed the leaves, placed them in a pot of water, and boiled them until the liquid turned dark and developed a distinct herbal taste. She strained out the leaves and small particles, added sugar or honey, and continued reducing the mixture. The warm bitterness gradually spread through the room, blending with the sweet steam thickening over the stove. When the syrup reached the hard candy stage, she dropped it by individual spoonfuls onto a prepared surface, or spread it into a thin layer to be cut after it cooled. The amber-colored candies were wrapped and stored for long journeys, cold and windy days, times when young children needed something that would dissolve slowly in their mouths. Item number 1 stood in the final position because it connected many worlds. It connected the garden to the kitchen, dried leaves to hot sugar, knowledge of the seasons to the care of a family. The maker had to know which plant to gather, when the time was right, and how to cook it in a way that preserved its distinctive flavor. The bitterness came first. The sweetness came afterward. 25 candies had passed by, but the final card carried no scent of chocolate or vanilla. It held the smell of dried leaves, old paper, and a form of care that had once been understood through actions, long before anyone thought to put it into words. The 25 candies we have just seen all began with familiar ingredients from the pantry, including sugar, butter, potatoes, peanuts, cream, maple syrup, and herbal leaves. Each candy required its own kind of attention, whether watching the color of the sugar, waiting for the surface to lose its shine, pulling the cream candy by hand until the mass gleamed like satin. In Harlan County in 1973, the recipe box once opened beside a pot of boiling sugar. Now the bubbling has gone quiet. The wooden spoon rests beside the tin tray, where a few candy crumbs still cling to the thin layer of butter. Those families made candy to turn what they had into a joy large enough to share around the table. It was why every piece of candy once carried the mark of a hand. Every shard of peanut candy kept its own broken edge, and the tin box often returned from a neighbor's house with something different inside. The herbal candy card is placed beside the honeycomb candy card, which still bears a streak of syrup in one corner. The lid closes, leaving the same narrow gap as before. If you remember a candy like this, leave its name in the comments and subscribe to the channel so we can continue opening these old recipe cards together. The box closes. The pot of sugar has cooled, but the scents of butter, molasses, and waxed paper remain.